Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time. This is the first continuation of our episode, National Harpoon's Japanese Vacation. I am joined, like I was on that, by Eric Bond. Eric, do you want to say hello to the nice people?
Hello, nice people.
So, we really liked the last topic. Just to give people a little bit of a refresher on it, basically not Tsar at this point, but Nicholas, who becomes Nicholas II, is killed in 1891 when he is on tour, kind of a vacation, kind of a world tour of Japan. He has another brother who does not last long as Tsar, and his youngest brother, Michael, eventually becomes Tsar. That leads to a strengthening of Russia because he actually wants to be Tsar, I guess is a good way of saying it. He actually pays attention to affairs of state, but also kind of starts modernizing, starts liberalizing the country. And we led that right up to a First World War that began in 1911, I believe.
That is correct. So at this point, Germany is sending a military vessel into northern African possessions held by France, known as the Agadir Crisis, begins the First World War in 1911.
And the primary reason for that is basically Germany sees Russia strengthening and says, we need to handle this now, which was actually a pretty serious concern of theirs come 1914, that we need to have this out now, because if we don't, they'll be that much more powerful. They're growing quicker than we are. Is that fair?
That and just a kind of jealousy of the other European powers, because Germany is recently unified within the last half century and yet is being denied the benefits of a great world power, such as access to Europe and Asia.
Right. So with the biggest difference I think that we came across was with a Tsar. I'm going to do it once. I'm going to do it right now. I don't think I'll do it much more. Tsar Mikhail. From now on, we can call him Michael. He, even in our timeline, was a lot more hands-on. He was very involved in whatever role he played in the First World War. And we think that would lead to basically the Russian Empire or Russian state, whatever form it's in at this point, really having a lot more success than it did in our timeline. Is that fair?
That is correct. We would see it probably develop closer to a constitutional monarchy in the mold of Great Britain at this time, probably building off its own tradition of Zemstva local unions and the Grand Duchy of Finland, where the Tsar was already a constitutional monarch within their realm.
Okay. So all of those things happening. Also, with the First World War going on, Russia stays in it. Russia isn't just shambling through this and falling apart. And when you look at the timeline on it, I mean, between when Russia in our timeline signed the peace and the end of and when Germany collapsed, less than a year. I mean, they are right next to each other. So if Russia is just a little luckier, is just a little better run, it stays in till the end. Is that fair?
That is fair. And where we had concluded that this would still bring them into competition for China and Korea with Japan, still sparking a Russo-Japanese war. It's a little bit different because now we have a constitutional monarchy with a Russian sort of parliament guiding the war, but it's still an outdated military for the most part with poor military leadership. Still leads to a Japanese victory over Russia, and we left them with a more reactionary wing of the Black Hundreds, either coming into power or at least being a very vocal minority.
But fast forwarding to our First World War, I guess.
Right,
we said it
ending
would
in 1914.
basically that the clock starts ticking as soon as the war starts. Germany's economy can only sustain itself for so long with that many productive workers at the front, not harvesting, not creating, not building stuff. So around 1914, Germany collapses. And how does it collapse? What happens?
Basically, the Kaiser was making a radio address and found out that apparently he had abdicated before he abdicated.
So he just missed the memo.
Yeah, he missed the memo that his general staff had pretty much agreed. This cannot go further. We need to abolish the monarchy because the Kaiser has led us into too many squabbles.
And at the same time as that's going on, something's happening in the other major German service arm, the Navy, which is these things are, contemporaneous here, happening the same day, the same week. There's, you can really discuss whether one thing is affecting the other or whether these are just two different streams coming together. But one of the orders that is issued, even in our timeline, but we think it's something similar in this one, is for the German high seas fleet to go out and have one big final fight with the British fleet to attempt to break the blockade. In our timeline, those sailors realize this is a suicide mission and decide not to do it. Same thing happens here. And so while you also have this old Prussian high command letting the Kaiser know he's abdicated, there's also political action happening from the bottom. Is that fair?
Yes, at this point we would see. So there was a German Socialist Party who was active in the parliament. These would be seen as more those who want to reform Germany into a socialist state. However, a breakaway faction who were strictly opposed to even entering the war in the first place, the Spartacist League, decides to essentially overthrow the government and expel even the monarch from being within the borders of the country.
So that happens, we think. Who would you consider the Spartacist analogous to in our timeline?
The Bolsheviks.
So, yes, you kind of have a Soviet-style system developing in Germany at the same time that they've now surrendered. They've lost the war. In terms of a peace settlement, it looks a lot like ours, at least in the West. But the only difference, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say the major difference in my mind is this is without a question Germany's fault for sending in a military force into French territories. Whereas in the real timeline, it's a matter of these overlapping alliances and miscommunication after the Duke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated. In this one, it's a much cleaner, much more tidier uh what's the word? Cause bellicum.
Yes, that. And the other thing I'd say is this, at least in our timeline, when Germany was required to accept the blame for everything that happened, you're absolutely right in that there were overlapping um, alliances, overlapping causes of this. Germany didn't put the gun in Princip's hand. But here's the other thing. In our timeline, there was a significant part of the German power structure that looked kindly upon the old Kaiserreich, upon the old German Empire. In this example, you've got an explicitly anti-imperialist, anti-Kaiser party coming to power in Germany. So it's almost as if they blame not Germany, but the Kaiser. And there's a real concerted effort on their part to say, listen, that was his problem. He did that. We didn't. Very similar to kind of the GDR in our timeline's view of what wound up happening under the Nazis, in that they were like, that was them. Germans had nothing to do with it. That was a small clique. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And they had attempted in our timeline to overthrow the Weimar Republic because they felt the Weimar Republic is too moderate to actively handle the ongoing crises.
Basically, view them as Kerensky.
Exactly. The Weimar made the mistake of, instead of sending in the army, which was the legitimate force that would handle it, they had sent in roving bands of not yet returned home discharged soldiers, the Freitag, who were basically kind of a mix between mercenaries and black ops, and for lack of a proper allegory that I can come up with.
I feel like the black ops leaves out, makes it feel like these were more specialist people. These were, to use the German term, Frenchfein. These were regular GIs.
But because the Weimar Republic used them, it only told the citizens, wow, our government is very weak if they can't handle this themselves. So in our created timeline, we have the Spartacists still making the same conclusion of the government is too weak to handle these issues. We did not want this war, so we will overthrow.
And again, very much like the Bolsheviks, when you call out the Russian army, you don't know which side they're going to point those guns at. And I think this is a real example. The Spartacists could have really had could have used the German army itself. They were very successful in the German Navy.
Well, especially because this is an even more depleted German army, because they've now had all fronts just absolutely depleted. So we have a more radicalized army of just, we will go with whoever says we're going to stop fighting and just protect what's ours.
Right. So one last thing that we kind of talked about that I want to kind of finish up is Germany in this scenario. We said that they're pretty much prostate in the West. The same economic conditions prevail in this treaty as did in Versailles. The difference is that Russia is still in this war, and Russia still has a seat at this table. So what do we think? What does Russia get from this? Because if you look at Versailles, every country that's there has something they want. So talk a little bit about what do we think are Russia's shopping list when they show up? What do they want to walk away with?
If they do not walk away with the state of Poland, they are definitely going to walk away with Constantinople.
I think both. I think going into the war, they did control a good part of Poland. Um, I think today, actually, we talked about this, that the eastern border of Germany is going to look very similar to what it does today, because the Russians are going to draw a border of Poland very friendly to Poland, because it will be, as you talked a little bit about, in personal union with Russia. That the Russian Tsar will be called the king or something of a kingdom, of reborn kingdom of Poland. Is that fair?
Right, a Grand Duchy of Poland.
And
Yes.
north of the old Russian possessions is Prussia. You had Prussian aristocrats and Polish peasants. That area is given to Poland. Um, and I think that really changes the dynamic of German politics, because we talked a little bit about this. Um, all of your traditional aristocrats are Prussians. Even looking at how Germany did reunify, the other German states were conquered by Prussia, period. They can say that they joined together in the North German Confederation and all these. Prussia conquered the other German states and made the German Empire in its image. Now they've lost that heartland. They've lost where Bismarck is from. They've lost where Hindenburg and Ludendorff are from. Maybe those people are still floating around in Germany, but they're refugees. They do not have even the limited power base that they did in our Weimar era. Do you agree with that?
I would say they would definitely be the politically dispossessed at this time. I I do think a German Soviet state is probably more efficiently run than the Russian state was in our timeline, just because we are having so many people who were actively involved in the political structure that they're coming with a working knowledge of how to operate a government.
The SPD, the German Socialist Party, going into the war, was the largest political party in the world by membership.
Right.
Um, okay.
So,
Anything else? Yeah, go ahead.
so if we're going to sum up, so we have a Soviet style German state. It is devoid of Prussia. Any Prussian aristocrats who are still kicking around either have nothing to really base their power on, or are in Poland or Russia, maybe living as emigres with whatever cash they have. The German state is probably still going to have a lot of internal issues, as they're going to have to deal with food and their debt with France in particular at this time. But ultimately, maybe a more stable state as we go forward. So we'll get more into that in the future. Who do you want to hit up next?
The Irish. Or, sorry, in honor of Alexis, Great Britain.
Yes. So we have a Great Britain. George V is currently on the throne. He is not what I would say an intellectual. He's not a reactionary. He sees himself as purely just a figurehead, very much the same kind of role we've set up for Michael in Russia, where he says, I don't really approve of things like suffrage and Welsh or Irish nationalism, but I will at least moderate the conversation. These are ultimately issues for the parliament to decide. So now in 1914, we have a younger George V than in our own timeline. He's really come in an age of war, because he only became the king 11 months in 11 months before the crisis. And even then, he'd have to be crowned 2 months after the Agadir crisis started. So he's under a lot of stress at this time. And in our own timeline, what had happened was in 1910, the House of Commons was seen as the primary house of government. There had been so much upheaval with the House of Lords vetoing any and all legislation that was challenging the status quo that eventually they had to rework the Constitution in order for business to get done within the House. If this sounds like anything, I have no idea what you're talking about, and I ask you leave our podcast. Going forward, we see.
So, what's one of the really important pieces of
one of the
legislation they do wind up passing in our timeline?
In our timeline, one of the most important pieces of legislation is the devolution of the. I'm kidding, Chris. I just wanted to see your reaction. It's the promise of an Irish home rule in 1914. This got pushed towards after the war because of World War I, but that resulted in the Easter Uprising in 1916. So now there is not even legislation on the board if this is 1911.
Or call it 1913, 2 years into the war, after Britain has had to start conscripting Irishmen into the war effort, started having to put those stresses on the society.
Right. Basically, there had been a promise that we'll start having the votes, because this was all intertwined with the question of who is going to be the primary house. Will it be the House of Lords or the House of Commons? And the Irish nationalists, who were associated with the Liberal Party, the predecessor to the modern Labour Party, had made the agreement of like, okay, we will support you, with the Liberals saying, we're going to vote for Irish Home Rule 3 times, it will be denied, and we will use this as the foundation to make the House of Commons the primary house. But now that's all been thrown askew. So do we still see now an Easter Uprising, say 1913, as opposed to 1916? We say yes.
We do. Does it meet with any more success?
I would say probably not. I don't think it's worse by any means. I think we have public sympathy for the rebellion is probably higher than in our own timeline was, because there's not even a promise that, oh yes, we're finally going to get home rule.
Mm-hmm.
The people, go ahead.
No, so the one thing we also thought about was, so the Easter Rising itself, the homegrown effort, is not successful. But in the immediate aftermath of the war, after there has been so much support for independence because of the stresses put on Irish society because of the war, now you have an explicitly expansionist major power looking to export their political ideology. Literally, that their political ideology says if they do not export it to the rest of the world, they will not survive. As opposed to really Great Britain kind of being unchallenged in Ireland in our timeline and able to basically make whatever deal they felt was appropriate. Would you agree with that?
I would say that would be appropriate. The problem with the Irish Home Rule movement is that in this new timeline, they would at least have David Lloyd George, who was a proponent for Irish Home Rule, even against the wishes of those in Ulster in Northern Ireland, who very much wanted everything to be run through the British Parliament in London. So having this, if we're still going to see an Irish Civil War following this, perhaps they're granted home rule as opposed to just being their own free state. perhaps we would see some kind of reactionary movement. I would imagine it would probably be from those in the nationalist movement who say it's not enough anymore just to have home rule. They gave us home rule because we fought, we want freedom. We would probably see those in Northern Ireland do an uprising of like, not only do we not want home rule, we want to end all of this. So we're not a free state, we're not home rule, we are just Brits living in another part of the kingdom. And then those further south in Ireland, in about the Limerick area in particular, where it was popular, they're saying like, hey, Germany just had a socialist uprising that's pretty successful and hasn't been put down. Because,
and by the way, is probably shipping us some help.
Yeah, definitely shipping us help. And there were scattered socialist movements all throughout the British, what will one day become the British Commonwealth, but is the United Kingdom for now. So this is a prime situation to where Ireland basically becomes a three-way civil war where everybody is out. Maybe not so much the Soviet Irish, who are just like, yeah, we just want to do our own little collectives and just be left alone. Thanks. But that will not be enough. It's basically going to be embroiled in a civil war. So it'll be interesting to see how Britain will handle this if they try to say you're just going to be in a home, your own free state, if we still see a partition of Ireland, or if we even see a three-way partition of Ireland, depending on how successful the Soviets are in this more disorganized timeline. My guess is probably as successful as they were in our own, of being quashed by the other two, neither of whom were particularly fond of the Soviets.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to discuss about, I guess, the rocks off the northwest coast of Europe? I think that's a pretty safe name to call it at this point.
Well, I had wanted to know if you think, I know we're mostly focusing on the foreign policy of everything. Do you think women's suffrage would still happen in England in the 1920s as opposed to then?
I think two key suffrage points, actually. Both women's suffrage and universal manhood suffrage.
Oh, that's
Even,
right.
yes, even up until you literally had people being drafted into the British Army that were not allowed to vote because they did not have property. It was lowered and lowered and lowered over the course of the 19th century. It still was on the books. It still existed. So I think the industrialization of British society, the stress is put on it. I don't see anything we've talked about that would change both the need for women involved in society, both in war work and things like that. And like I said, it just, when a nation takes its citizens that don't have full rights and expects them to defend it and has to count on them to do that, that's a shaky situation.
Yeah, I honestly think Germany might do women's suffrage first, just because there were female leaders of the Spartacist League. So, if anything, there might be pushback against even women's suffrage or even universal male suffrage if everybody now has the scapegoat of like, well, the Germans have that. Are you more German than British, bruh? Bruv?
Okay. Okay, but I still think I still say there's you can't. You just need to extend it. And
Yeah.
also, if you're trying to say if you're trying to contrast yourself with the Soviet Union or with Soviet Germany, giving every single person a free and fair vote in your elections is democracy. If you are sitting there saying, trying to defend property requirements, trying to keep half your population from participating in the political process, you're not there fighting for democracy. You need to say you're fighting for something else.
Just fighting for the House of Lords, Chris. That's all I'm about.
And you know what? And you can say we're fighting for king and country. You can say we're fighting for our God. You can say, but you just can't say we are the democratic free world standing up against Soviet tyranny. You can't.
That is true. Do we want to talk about Britain's overseas possessions in the Middle East right now, or do we want to talk about France first? Who is
Let's
the main
do
competitor?
France. Let's do France. Kind of the Danubian Basin, Russia, and then we'll hit the Middle East because we will have already talked about France, Britain, and Russia, which are all going to kind of play in that area, and Austria as well.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a France that's probably the most successful that they are going to be, because this war was about colonial possessions. And while we would still definitely see the same kind of carnage inflicted on the Somme, this is a French who's given even more of a free hand to be punitive with the Germans.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
So, given that they were clearly attacked by the Germans, maybe you do want to discuss what happens on their eastern border. Does that still look like it does today? They've retaken Alsace-Lorraine from the German Empire. Do they stop? Do they go further? And also keeping in mind, just on that other side of Germany is both a very wealthy, a very industrialized area, but also an area that has a lot of support for the Spartacist. So is that kind of a poison pill in the Saar area in the Rhineland that you just don't want to go near, because if you do, now they're your problem?
I think if cooler heads prevail, they will just stop at Alsace-Lorraine, just because France was already operating under a state of internal pressures even before the war. Like during the Dreyfus affair, they were dealing with that whole scandal. They were also committing active espionage on their espionage, not espionage, but basically active spying campaigns on their citizens, from trade unionists to socialists to even monarchists who wanted to overthrow the republic. So this is basically a surveillance society already. So if we have a more bellicose Poincaré in this, who doesn't have anyone holding him back, even his prime minister, who's more interested in joining things like the League of Nations, which does not have as much, maybe wanting to bring back the concert of Europe in a new form.
I don't think the League of Nations exists.
Probably not.
Completely slipped. The United States probably is not involved in this. They have other concerns, which we'll get to in part 3.
Yeah. Do you see them trying to restart a concert of Europe style to where they're able to work out things diplomatically, or do you think this is ultimately like we cannot cooperate if the Germans are involved?
I think, well, first and foremost, remember now you also have a politically dangerous Germany, not just kind of a nationalistically dangerous Germany. I think what you would see is similar to like a Richelieu policy, where everybody surrounding Germany is trying to take a piece of it. And you're not actually dealing with Germany as a unified political entity. You're just trying to keep them weak. because if they unify, then you're in trouble. But if you keep Russia making trouble on their eastern border, we're about to talk about the Austrian Empire, or whatever becomes of that. If you keep them containing, I think that's that's what this is. This is containment. This is France cooperating with the other powers of Europe to contain the Spartacist pathogen. I think that is a really good way to think about what France would be doing in this case.
Yeah. I don't see an outright military intervention into the Spartacus because for the reasons we discuss of like it's too much of a powder keg that could light up those who are missing the Paris Commune who are still alive and their kids who have been brought up on it. So, and they're probably still more concerned about their foreign possessions at this time and keeping those well underhand.
I'd agree. So, do you have any other comments on France at this point, on French policies?
Not at this time. I think as long as Germany is kept contained and the money keeps coming in for the war debt, I think
they can call themselves whatever they want. They can organize themselves however they want. We're just going to let them be.
Exactly.
Okay. So the next interesting thing we discussed is, I'm going to say the Balkans, because when we get talking about this, what existed in our timeline is probably not going to, but it's a really interesting question. And this is one of those places where we're going to see a lot of changes. So go ahead and set us up.
Okay, so in our own timeline, we commonly start the cause of the war being the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which used to just be the Austrian Empire, but then it was split into a constitutional dual monarchy between Austria and Hungary. And their main concern was the rise of nationalism as different ethnic groups were kind of asking for their own principalities, their own self-government. Very similar to what we see happening in Ireland with their questions about home rule, this being more along ethnic lines.
Except that you're absolutely right in that I do think it's interesting to think about Belfast and how you have neighborhoods confessionally divided, how you have Irish Catholic and Protestant neighborhoods. The Balkans wish it was just so binary, that there were just two groups to deal with.
Yeah. In this one, it's more like 10 different groups in maybe a 15-mile radius.
Especially in the cities.
Yeah. So there were ideas about, before the war, there were ideas on how to fix this. Franz Ferdinand famously said, I want to do kind of like a federal state system like the US does, to where I would be a constitutional monarch and it would be these federalized republics of Austria-Hungary, which he thought would be the best way to diffuse tension and have everybody have a voice in the government. Franz Josef probably saying something like, it'll never work. Also, I'm confused. Is it the 1860s again? Where's my youth?
Literally, he has been in power since 1848, and the first national revolutions that ever touched the Austrian Empire, right?
Right. He's basically a man out of time for everybody.
So in our timeline, he passes away in 1916 in the middle of the war. Is it safe, do you think, to suggest that given the stress of the war and given that he already has a little bit of a Palpatine thing going on here, that he passes away in the middle of our war, our earlier war.
I would say it's possible. My then follow-up question to you, Chris, would be, do you think Franz Ferdinand then tries to negotiate a separate peace treaty out of this new world war?
With who? Who is the primary power that the Austrians are fighting?
Presumably the Russians.
The Russians. And I think this is a really interesting idea that in our timeline, you had the Russians being represented as a pan-Slavic movement. That is an explicit threat to the nature, to the existence of the Austrian-Hungarian nation. Austrian-Hungarian state, the empire. What we've talked about is a more liberal, a more democratic, a more federalist person in charge of Russia. Very much it sounds like Michael and Franz Ferdinand are kindred spirits. Is that a safe? They sound a lot alike.
Yeah, if you look into my notes, I was trying to be very explicit. On the British side, with the heir at this time, everybody calls him David, but he's Edward the Seventh or Edward the Eighth in our timeline, to where he would be a foil for Michael, in that they sound pretty much the same up until the point to where you get to their political preferences, and Michael goes one way and Edward takes a hard right. But in this one, yeah, Franz Ferdinand and Michael definitely would be on the same team.
Wind up on the same team. I think that's the, yeah.
Yeah. I think it would be possible for Franz Ferdinand to steer Austria-Hungary out of it, but needing to make concessions with the Russians about the Slavs within their reach.
I'm specifically thinking about Galicia becoming part of this new Polish state and some of the other. Do you think this is a handover of the Slavs, of these Slavic lands, or do you think this is a agreement with Russia that they'll be given some sort of home rule, that their minority rights will be respected within the bigger Austrian Empire?
I think if Michael had it's his way, it would be a home rule. Okay. I think depending on who is the primary power in this alternate Duma, that's going to be a whole other question of what they're going to want to do.
Okay. So do you have anything else about the Balkan Basin, about the Danube, about Austria?
I think Austria, at least within its own borders, becomes a constitutional monarchy still.
Okay.
I think they probably have concerns about the German Spartacist. I was calling it the Spartacist Soviet Republic in my notes.
Okay.
So I think they have concerns about it, but are just too weak to intervene.
I think they may also actually wind up being a home for a lot of those German refugees. Those more conservative forces that can't find an accommodation within the German Soviet state. But with that being said, let's go ahead and finish the tour of kind of the traditional Europe with the place that started all of this fork, Russia. Russia stays in the war under Michael. It is victorious. It does take territories in Eastern Europe, but it incorporates them as a personal union, kind of building something similar to Austria-Hungary, that we're going to have a bit of a federal system. What else? What else strikes you about Russia?
Oh, there is probably going to be more and more conflict between the Duma and Michael. Ironically, because they want Michael to have more power. And Michael, I
Okay.
think, definitely trying to step away from being an absolutist, trying not to fall in the trap of like, it would be so easy if I just asserted myself.
Okay.
But
Okay.
I see him as being someone committed to trying to be a constitutional monarch in the mold of Great Britain, which was always his guiding star. I think he would probably be one to push for more grand duchies like we have going on with Poland, if there is one for those territories that they have just taken. I think that would be
Okay.
fascinating. But we haven't really talked about the underground movements such as the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks, the SRs, who are far more frustrated in their efforts to overturn a government which has, for the most part, peacefully, well, not so peacefully if you're Jewish, I'm assuming, with the Black Hundreds going around, but for the most part, peacefully gone into a democratic or constitutionally monarchical state.
I mean, if you do look at our timeline, the people within the czarist system pushing for these reforms, pushing for local economic development, pushing for more democratic governance, are the people that the Russian radicals make sure don't last very long. They really kill off the reformers because those people are a bigger threat to them than an arch conservative, right?
Right. It's like with the arch conservatives, those are great for propaganda because you can. It's kind of like what Lenin said, like the worse it is, the better it is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But now with a reformed system in place and arguably a ideological challenge coming from, ironically, the German Soviet state, which has a lot of reformers in its government still.
And support for these radicals coming over that border from that German Soviet state.
Yeah. There's probably going to be a challenge within the Bolshevik ranks of like, well, how do we proceed now? Do we just become a political party? Do we seek active power? And somebody is going to get the idea of like, let's just do what the SRs do and shoot the Tsar.
Yes, yes. And so we talked a little bit about this. What happens when they shoot the Tsar?
Well, since we can't really go with, since we've changed the Tsar Michael's marriage, we don't have a child that we can point to of like, yeah, this kid would probably still be born in our timeline. So we're kind of going with probably childless. Or if there is a child, they're too young to assume the throne.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So who fills this vacuum?
I have a thought, but
Please.
I was going to say Grand Duke Alexei, the cousin.
Okay.
Do you remember from the series? He was the one who Nicholas tried to make a dictator at one point during the 1905 push. Because he thought he would be the one who could just eliminate. But I'm thinking someone in the family who's more of an arch conservative, who the Black Hundreds could rally behind.
Okay.
Who would you recommend?
You and I discussed this. I think that may actually be interesting, but with kind of a slight change of flavor here, in that this new person is this new Tsar Alexei owes his power to these paramilitary groups that rise up after the assassination and make sure that Russia doesn't go the way of Germany. I think, and this is a really interesting discussion of these two different countries, because the threat of the other very much leads to a reaction against its political philosophy.
Right.
So, and the point I'm getting at is that while you may have Alexei as a nominal head of power, I think he's a little more like Victor Emmanuel in our Italy to a Mussolini or I really hate this, but I'm going to have to, King Michael of Romania in our history, Antonescu or somebody else like that, who's more national populist, more
Like
broad-based.
Juan Carlos to Francisco Franco.
Somewhat, except that Juan Carlos was not brought in from the very beginning as the figurehead. He was installed later on in Franco's dictatorship. But that's absolutely, yes, another example of it. So you've got this group that supports a czar, that lets a czar still exist, but really takes Russia in a dramatically different direction.
Maybe they're very fond of Z as like a symbol.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Top of my head.
Yeah. So there was. Do we have? Are we finished with Russia in this scenario?
It depends on how much they are okay with Germany being itself.
Yeah. I think they're still going to be digesting Poland. They're still going to be worried about whatever is happening up in Prussia. So there's going to be a bit of a respite for that conflict, but I don't think it does go away.
Yeah. I don't know if we see a World War II in 1940. It's going to be, we're going to have to talk about Asia and the Americas and what's going on there.
Yes.
But we have just to recap for everyone. So we have a Germany that has started a socialist republic that is poor but stable. We have a France, which is more bellicose but more involved with its foreign holdings at this time. We have an England who is embroiled with a three-way civil war on the Irish, on the island of Ireland. I don't know why my brain went there, but we have Austria trying to make it work as a federal state, taking in any German nobles who have been displaced by the Spartacists, and also trying to work as a federal republic in their own right. And we have a Russia which has made a rightward turn towards the populist nationalism of the Black Hundreds, maybe with Grand Duke Alexei as a figurehead.
Okay. In our discussion, there was one other region we wanted to talk about.
Turkey or the Ottomans?
Call it the entire Middle East, because that's the other thing. Turkey's limited to Anatolia, but we talked about Britain, we talked about France a little bit and its involvement. So these are all kind of players involved in the Middle East. So go ahead and set some stuff up for us.
Okay, so in our timeline, the Middle East was I will send you a link for a series which basically describes how it was split up, but it was largely contested by the French and by the British, with the British holding a mandate over Palestine, where there is an uptick in Jewish returnees from the diaspora who were inspired by Zionism, basically working under the assumption that because of things like the Dreyfus Affair and so many years of Jews not receiving emancipation, particularly following the Napoleonic era, where a lot of rights were revoked for Jewish citizens, they thought the only way we can protect ourselves is to have a Jewish state. So we see a lot of communes or kibbutzes start up in Palestine and coming into its own. We see the French largely hold control over Syria, don't they?
Lebanon and Syria.
Lebanon and Syria. And then we have areas like Transjordan, which are largely under the rule of the British, but there is a power sharing agreement with the locals there. So what is now Jordan is the descendants of Transjordan and these areas. The Sharif of Mecca, for instance.
So in all of these agreements and in all of these deals that were cut between the Allied powers, the Triple Alliance, once the Ottoman Empire became involved in the war, there's one group that was definitely promised some stuff, wound up not collecting on it. What is that group? What is that nation?
That is Russia not getting Constantinople.
Because that is kind of a crowning achievement of any Russian leader is Constantinople, is a warm water port, is access to the world. So Russia very much wants, I'm going to call it Byzantium / Constantinople / Istanbul / I'm going to go ahead and drop it because I like this for a show title, Mickalograd. So every time somebody else takes over that city, they name it after something.
So Istanbul was Constantinople, but now it's Mickalograd.
Mickalograd.
To rip off They Might Be Giants. Understood.
Nope, I know exactly what you're talking about. So something just crossed my mind, which is how do the developments we talked about, domestic political developments in Russia, does that change what is going on in the British territories?
Well, I was going to say, I think France, because of England being so tied up with the Irish and the Civil War happening there, I was going to say that France probably has much more territorial concessions over the Middle East.
Okay.
In this timeline, maybe having to primarily share it with Russia, should Russia decide we also want Turkey.
Okay.
As parts
of Anatolia.
Yeah, parts of Anatolia.
Certainly Armenian sections. I could definitely see that happening. I was more talking about, do you think you see an uptick in Zionist emigration into Israel, Palestine? And do you see that moved up?
You know what? I'm divided on the question myself. On one hand, I could totally see it surging upward following the war, that a lot of people are just like, we're getting out of Europe. But I'm wondering if the fact of a France still bearing the stain of the Dreyfus Affair, being in control, let's say if they've been granted control of Palestine, if that isn't its own turnaway. But you know who was thinking about making a Jewish home state at this time? Japan. But maybe we'll save that as a side note for our next episode.
I just think the other interesting thing is to think about what is the policy of a revanchist, of an ultranationalist Russia. Do they buy you a ticket to get rid of you?
Well, when they were constructing the railroad in Harbin, in our own timeline, they did offer it. They sold it to Jewish citizens as you will be given an emancipated status within the city limits of Harbin.
Okay.
You just need to build this railroad for us. And as soon as they were done, it was then revoked.
Okay. So what else? I mean, we've talked about how that one little event 20 years before, 30 years before, really can just change the entire map of Europe. Do you have any other thoughts? And we definitely are going to address we want to make sure we take care of the whole world. So we intentionally discussed this. There is a third section coming, but is there anything else striking you about this world, about the European situation we just went through and described?
Well, we're seeing monarchies for the most part stay in place. So
nominally
moving more towards constitutions. You know, we've seen the displacement of the German Kaiser, who nobody is going to try, at least among the Allied powers, no one's going to try and reinstall him. So, gosh, it's just so damn interesting. I'm excited to see what will happen next, because I will need to meditate on it for a good long while.
Yes, we definitely will put some thought into the third installment of this little world tour we're doing. So I'd invite everybody to come back for that one. And just in closing, ask Eric, if one should come to a fork in the road, what should they do?
They should take it.
All right. Look forward to seeing you guys next week.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.